One of the easiest and most reliable ways to add volume and depth to architectural drawings is with an ink wash. This traditional rendering technique, taught and used at the École des Beaux-Arts, uses diluted ink or watercolor in different concentrations to create variation in tone across your drawing. I honestly think it's one of the most approachable shading techniques out there, because once you understand the process, you can get beautiful results on your very first try with almost no practice. In this video, I'm going to show you everything you need to get started, walk you through my process, and finish with a little demonstration of how I use this technique to create a wall-ready architectural drawing. The first step is preparing the ink wash itself. You can use any color India ink or watercolor. In this drawing of the Pantheon, I used several different colors. You can watch that process through the link in the corner. But for this tutorial, I'm going to keep things simple and stick to black ink only. I'm using black ink by Dr. P.H. Martens because the built-in pipette makes it really easy to control how much ink I'm adding to the water. To make my lightest solution, I start with a couple of ounces of water in a cup and add about 3 to 4 drops of ink. Then I mix it well and test the tone on a scrap piece of paper. Usually a lighter mix will give you a smoother, higher quality wash, but it also means that you'll need more layers to build up darker tones. For me, 4 drops of ink in 2 ounces of water work really well. I'm using plastic cups with lids, so I can save my ink solutions over the several days it usually takes me to finish a drawing. While I'm at it, I'll also mix several darker solutions right away. You can work with just one mix and build variation through layering, but having multiple concentrations saves a lot of time. And having gradually increasing concentrations is necessary for creating gradients. At the very least, you'll want one darker mix for that. I've prepared 3 darker mixes with 6, 8, and 10 drops of ink for 2 ounces of water in each. Besides the ink solutions, you'll also need a cup of clean water for rinsing your brush, some paper towels to dry it, and of course the brush itself. The best brushes for this technique are watercolor brushes. Soft brushes that can hold a good amount of water. Now let's talk about paper. The whole point of this technique is to let the wash run down the page in a controlled way. So you need paper that can absorb a lot of water without tearing. Watercolor paper works really well for this, and generally the thicker the paper, the better. That said, typical watercolor paper often has a rough texture and can be tough on your felt tip pens, so hot press watercolor paper is probably your best option. I didn't have any at home, so I'm just using cold press watercolor paper. No matter how thick your paper is though, all that water will still make it warp. So I highly recommend using a watercolor paper block, where the sheets are glued on all 4 sides to keep them flat. Once the drawing is finished, you can cut the sheet free to reveal the next one underneath. As I mentioned earlier, this technique relies on letting the ink wash run down the page evenly. And for that to happen, you need gravity to help move the liquid. So having a sloped surface is really important. I'm lucky enough to have a drafting table at home that I can just tilt. But you can use any board or even a large book to create a slope. One other nice thing about using a paper block is that you can just lean it against something and instantly create a sloped surface. Now let's actually do the wash. First, I will show you how to create a smooth, even field of tone. Dip your brush into the ink solution and start at the top of the area you want to cover. The goal is to keep enough liquid on the page to maintain a small bead or drop of solution at the bottom edge of the wash. If that bead disappears, the wash can dry unevenly and leave darker marks or streaks behind. Then use your brush to guide that bead downward, adding some more solution as needed to keep the bead roughly the same size. The tricky part is carefully controlling the edges while still maintaining the bead. A good exercise is practicing to maintain 2 beads at once to make sure the ink doesn't dry before you reach the bottom. Once you get to the bottom, dry your brush on a paper towel and use the dry brush to collect any excess liquid. And that's it, a perfectly smooth tone. Now I'll show you how to create a stepped gradient. Before adding another layer, let the wash dry completely. Try not to touch the paper with your fingers. Natural oils from your skin can repel the ink solution and create uneven spots. Here's an unfortunate example of that. You can see a few places where the paper must have been touched before I even started drawing. To create a stepped gradient, I simply layer the same wash over itself multiple times, letting each layer dry completely before adding the next one. A smooth gradient is a little trickier. For this, you'll need several ink solutions with different concentrations. You start the same way, by creating a bead of liquid at the top. Since I want my gradient to go from white to dark, I actually begin with clean water only. Then, gradually, I transition into my lightest ink solution. Then into a slightly darker one, then darker again, and finally the darkest tone near the bottom. The more intermediate mixes you have, the smoother your gradient will look, because the transitions between tones become less noticeable. If you want a stronger gradient, you can repeat the same process several times, slightly shifting where those tonal transitions happen each time. Just keep layering until you're happy with the result. Once the wash is completely dry, and depending on how careful you were with your edges, you may choose to trace your edges with ink to make them crisper. Even if your edges are perfect, you may still choose to do that to add another layer of detail or finish. You can use whatever pens or ink you like, but permanent fine liner pens work especially well here. One thing I've noticed is that because ink washes tend to have very subtle tonal variation, using pure black ink on top can sometimes make the drawing feel a little cartoonish and less complex and delicate. In my Pantheon drawing, I used black ink, and I still think it looks good, just a bit more stylized. If you want to preserve the softer, more delicate quality of the wash, gray fine liners work beautifully. Pigma Micron makes pens with dark and light gray inks, which are great for this. Now I'm going to show you how I apply this technique to a drawing of Michelangelo's dome of St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City. The entire basilica is absolutely sublime, but rendering the whole thing would probably be a project for another lifetime. So for this drawing, I'm limiting myself just to the dome. And even then, only to the amount of detail that I can realistically capture on a letter-sized sheet of paper. The drawing is a composite plan elevation section of the dome. I thought that this composition would allow me to play with the light on the exterior of the cupola and the shade on the interior. There are lots of ways to approach an ink wash rendering. You can be very disciplined and methodical and build up layers across the entire drawing from lightest to darkest, working on all the areas of the same value at once. Or you can begin with the darkest areas first and gradually work back toward the lighter tones. Or you can just enjoy the process, go with your feelings, and approach it more like a painting than a technical rendering, which is basically what I decided to do here. I'm jumping around the drawing quite a bit because I don't feel like sitting around waiting for layers to dry. So while one side dries, I work on another. You'll also notice that I rotate the drawing constantly, partly to create gradients in different directions, and partly just to avoid resting my hand on wet areas. Okay, I think this looks done. Now I'm going to let everything dry completely before tracing the line work with ink. I'm using a thicker gray pen for all the cut lines in section and plan, and a very fine tip pen for everything else. I want the line work to be only a shade darker than the wash itself, so I switch between light and dark gray pens depending on the area. At the very end, I'll erase any remaining pencil lines. And that's it. The drawing is finished. What do you think? I'm going to cut it out of the pad, mat it, and frame it. I hope you found this video useful and that you enjoyed the process as much as I did. I really recommend trying this technique out. I find it incredibly meditative. Please subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Happy drawing!